Good morning, everybody. Just a little bit of trivia. Hopefully this won't be on my time. There's a connection between the Big Lebowski and Mark Twain. I don't know if you are aware of this. One of the Coen brothers actually said that they were thinking of Mark Twain when they came up with Sam Elliott's character. So if you're familiar with the story, Sam Elliott's the cowboy, he's the narrator, he's sort of the mysterious stranger of the movie. So little trivia there. I have tons of it if you want more. It may not be directly related to Twain, but let's see. Okay, so Mark Twain reflected in 1906, "I have always preached, if the humor came of its own accord and uninvited, I have allowed it a place in my sermon. But I was not writing the sermon for the sake of the humor." Today, it's generally accepted that if Twain's writings were indeed sermons, they must have been countertheological. Coined by Stanley Brodwin, the term refers to his view that Twain's irreverent humor is grounded in an atheistic assumption that religion is a form of false consciousness. In heretical fictions, Berkhoff and Cicilla also find countertheology underlying Twain's humor, only for them it stems from his belief in God, albeit a petty, malicious, cruel, and vindictive God. They assert that Twain's humor in works like Roughing It is rooted in his deeply internalized Calvinism. Harold Kolb's take on Roughing It is far less gloomy. For him, Mark Twain's fictional journey into the West offers a complex, shifting, continually questioning, three-sided vision of human experience. He identifies deeper probings underlying Twain's humorous text, exploring the nature of belief, sources of authority, and book learning versus experience. These probings have less in common, in my opinion, with an atheistic or Calvinistic counter-theology than they do with the prevailing liberal theology of Twain's time. Religious liberalism emerged from the Enlightenment as an actual counter-theological critique of traditional religious orthodoxy. Along with its theological impact, liberal religion also had a significant literary influence on Twain's era. Unitarian ministers were the vanguard of an era of increasingly striking innovation and creativity in preaching that offered a freer form of homiletical expression that American Protestantism had yet seen. According to Buell, Unitarian preachers were the first of any American sect to move in the direction of the literary sermon. Buell asserts that Whitman's oratorical qualities, Melville's moral meditations, Hawthorne's allegories, and the Transcendentalist essay all draw from the same milieu which produced the great 19th century preachers. And to this august list, I would add Mark Twain's humorous literary sermons. As he was writing Roughing It, Twain showed his affinity with this genre when he noted that 9/10 of all the Christian charity in the hearts of the American people today got there by being filtered down from their fountainhead, the gospel of Christ, through dramas and tragedies and comedies, and not from the drowsy pulpit. So in this brief presentation, I will introduce how progressive ministers Twain knew on the frontier influenced both his low calling as a humorist and portions of Roughing It in theologically positive ways. Alexander Jones and others have noted that the currents of heterodox thought influencing Twain's youth in Hannibal include his uncle's universalism, Thomas Paine's radical deism, and Twain's initiation into Freemasonry. Twain's time out on the western frontier only deepened these currents. Wherever he went, he seemed to befriend religious liberals ranging from Freemasons, including Calvin Higbee, to whom Roughing It is dedicated, to progressive Protestant clergy. It isn't surprising that Twain encountered this mix of frontier religious liberals in the 1860s. According to Frankiel, the region's religious pluralism set it apart from the Eastern religious establishment. She cites an Orthodox Methodist bishop's lament over the Latin and Greek churches, Judaism in its Orthodox and heterodox schools, deism ranging from the devout to that of the blaspheming Paine, polytheism, and Mormonism that he found in California. In this diverse landscape, Frankiel notes that a small but significant minority of California's Protestant clergy became religiously tolerant, independent thinkers who softened their views on sin and punishment or de-emphasized conversion. Religious liberal values were also enshrined in Nevada's Constitution during Twain's time there. Ratified in 1864, the Constitution safeguarded the individual's liberty of conscience and free exercise of religious profession and worship. Twain warned in the Territorial Enterprise that if the Constitution did not pass, religious liberty will be at an end here. In November 1866, months after Twain returned to San Francisco from Hawaii, he was at the peak of his friendships with frontier liberal clergy. Not only did he help his friend Franklin Rising conduct worship services on the boat ride from Hawaii, they both happened to be in the islands at the same time. After his return that fall, Twain wrote an enthusiastic letter to his family declaring that he was running on preachers now. Twain had been running on these friends since at least 1864. Bellows, who valued the spirituality of laughter, was a fan of Twain's work and even encouraged him to write a book. Twain said Wadsworth never fails to preach an able sermon, and even joked that he wrote sermons for Wadsworth and Stebbins, with whom he was thick as thieves. It was within the context of these friendships that Twain wrote a letter to Orion in 1865, admitting to the powerful ambition he once had to be a preacher of the gospel. While the ministry's stock and trade religion thwarted this ambition, he announces his low literary calling to excite the laughter of God's children instead as a humorist. While Heretical Fictions identifies this letter as initiating Twain's transition from wanting to preach the gospel to covertly preaching his gospel in the form of a resentful countertheology, I see it as reflecting an important distinction many liberal ministers made between religion and the gospel. Essentially, they sought to liberate Christ's gospel from dogmatic institutionalism. Influential Unitarian minister Theodore Parker asserted that the real Christianity Jesus preached is not a system of doctrines, but rather a method of attaining oneness with God. Religious liberals in Twain's time, including those he met on the frontier, made a similar distinction. To help differentiate between a preacher of the gospel and an institutional minister, we can look at two ministers Twain knew in Nevada, the radical evangelical Franklin Rising, and A.F. White, who led a service Twain attended in 1862 at the Presbyterian Church co-founded by Orion. After White's service, Twain described him in a letter as a whining, nasal, wang-doodle preacher, and he complained, "I fear I shall not feel cheerful again until the beans I had for dinner begin to operate." White was among the smallest of small fry office seekers, in my opinion, flocking to Nevada that Twain derides in Roughing It. Among the official positions he held, for example, White was chaplain of the Territorial House of Representatives in 1861. Now, if White's Wang Doodle ministry represented institutional religion for Twain, Franklin Rising, whom he called a noble young fellow, epitomized a genuine preacher of the gospel. Rising belonged to the American Church Missionary Society, which was founded in 1860 to preach the gospel upon the basis of the moderate and liberal principles of the Protestant Episcopal Church. This meant preaching the simple, fundamental life truths of Christianity with little symbol, ritual, and legal forms. Initially holding services in unconventional settings around Virginia City, such as an unfinished church illuminated by candles stuck in beer bottles, Rising went on to establish a large church with a flourishing Sunday school. In addition to serving the mining community, Rising hoped to reach the marginalized population, including, he said, the Negro and Indian population that not now feel in any wise the influences of the ministry. Twain noted in the Territorial Enterprise that Rising had done as much as any man among us to redeem the community from its pristine state of semi-barbarism. A few years later, upon learning of Rising's death, Twain recalled in a letter to Olivia Langdon how he had helped the minister to preach in order to get at the better natures of the rough population about him. It's generally accepted that Rising is Twain's inspiration for the unnamed fledgling minister in Roughing It. Twain's observation that it was hard to preach a sermon in Nevada without using slang and be understood probably alludes to him helping Rising preach in frontier slang to the rough population there. Heretical fiction sees this comical encounter between fledgling minister and Scotty Briggs as exemplifying Twain's resentful Calvinistic counter-theology. According to their view, everyone in the ruined Eden of Virginia City is fallen and morally corrupt, even the minister, who profits financially from eulogizing a brawler, a killer, and a pimp. However, when seen in terms of the impact Rising's liberal Christianity had on the mining town's semi-barbarism, the encounter between the preacher and Briggs has a much more theologically positive spin. Not only does it ultimately result in constructing a Christian out of the miner's inborn nobility of spirit, Briggs goes on to teach a Sunday school class of pioneer small fry in a language they understood, just as Twain had once coached his friend, the noble Reverend Rising, to do. Well, finally, I'll conclude with how I see another of Twain's ministerial friends, Thomas Starr King, influencing both his role as a humorist and roughing it. Although King is rarely mentioned in Twain's studies, Twain mentions him in an 1895 interview when he said that he and King had been friends in California. Writing in 1864, just a few months after King's untimely death from diphtheria, Twain praised him in the Daily Morning Call as a great and good man, known for his tenderness and intellect, and an intellect of power and grandeur. King is seen as following Emerson in erecting the lecture platform into a kind of free pulpit. In 1863, when Artemus Ward lectured in San Francisco, Ward had his agent invite King to introduce him because of the minister's great popularity in California and influence over all classes of citizens in San Francisco. Unlike Franklin Rising, King did not inspire any characters in Roughing It. However, I believe his nature-based mystical Christianity infuses the book's account of Twain's time in Hawaii. I base this interpretation on the fact that to create this section, Twain draws heavily from his original correspondence from Hawaii in 1866, a time when King's popular theology would still have been fresh in Twain's memory. Now, contradicting heretical fictions, I see King's positive theological influence most clearly in the way Roughing It portrays nature in Hawaii. Because Twain undercuts romantic notions of an Edenic Hawaii with the harsh realities of menacing insects and Kilauea's sulfuric odor conjuring the presence of hell, heretical fictions views this subversion as another example of Twain's cynical Calvinistic counter-theology. However, this trait may actually evoke King's assertion that nature's scenic beauty and its harsh desolateness combined are the language and imagery of divine ideas. King preached in sermons about Lake Tahoe and the Sierra Nevada mountains that nature is not Calvinistic and that all the color of the world is part of the gospel of the world. According to King, one encounters divinity in the multi-hued splendor of Tahoe, as well as in the mountain's tortuous banks of canyons, the steep cliffs, and even in the way the awful gutter landslide opens its gray desolation. God hides his power and veils his awfulness in opulent beauty, and the most ragged and desolate wastes are chosen to display the rarest beauty. Rather than depicting Hawaii as the hellscape of a fallen world, perhaps Twain was inspired by King to see God's rarest beauty even amid Hawaii's most dangerous features. For example, in Twain's lecture on Hawaii, he echoes King, in my opinion, when he describes the unrivaled sublimity of witnessing Kilauea's lava flows, tearing up forests in its awful fiery path, and rioting through the shady dells and sinuous canyons. Based on such similarities, I feel it is possible that Roughing It's Hawaiian section reflects not a resentful Calvinistic counter-theology, but King's liberal gospel of the world that proclaimed all the objects of nature constitute a hieroglyphic alphabet which states great truths and sentiments that dwell in the infinite intellect. And I hope I was in my time.